Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So we're going to carry on with our part three of the web application development using ASP.NET Core. And for this one, we're going to be starting to add some controllers. Now, this is kind of where it gets exciting because you start to get to work with your data context as it relates to pushing data into your database. You also look at your views of your data as well. And this is also really important because when we're creating a web application, we want to be able to display data on a web page, edit, create, and do all the CRUD operations. That's our create, read, update, and delete. Fortunately, the way Visual Studio works is it pushes all these tools into our controller and creates our views for us. So there's only some minimal things that we have to do to make things work. So let's get started here. So the easy thing to do here, if we want to start by creating a controller, I am going to be working with my students database, okay, or my students table, I should say. And if you remember from our looking at the part two video, we looked at how the database was built when it was migrated. We have a students table, and generally, when you build a controller that relates to a data table, you'll name it the same name as the controller. So in this case, I'm going to name this students controller, and I'm going to use the entity framework modeling here. So this is going to create our views and create the all of the controller based on the entity framework. You can choose the other method, but to save time today, what we're looking at is just using the standard template method. So let's get started here. We're going to click on Add, and the model that we're going to be using for this controller is student. All right. The next thing is you can add a page layout, but by default it's going to be using the page layout that's in the shared folder under views. You can see that automatically it created a controller name of students.controller, and that's the plural form of the model that we're using. If you notice here, I've called it student, so that represents one student, whereas students represents a table of students. Let's click on add. Now, one thing that we want to be aware of when we're creating a controller is by default, when we're adding some data to our database, we want to think about how our student model is set up. When we set up our student model, we created two properties, one called the create date and another one called the edit date. Now, the create and edit date are two special properties because the create date is only set when the item is created. The edit date is set every time the item is edited. All right. Now, I'm going to show you a couple tricks here that are going to be really interesting. At least I think so. And I think that they're gonna help a lot of people out because there is often times when we look at using controllers that we have a lot of redundant code. And so today we're going to start off with basically what the controller does. So let's start off at the top here. You'll see that we have um, a property or a field related to our data context. And then in our students controller constructor, the data context is injected into our controller. So if you remember back when we were looking at startup, we had it over here where we did a injection of the data context into this service. So every time we have dependency injection set up on a class or anything that we're using that could implement dependency injection, it's automatically going to pick up on this. It's going to say, oh, I have a data context available, so let's inject it into this class. So essentially, that's how this data context ends up into the controller, and we'll run through that as we start to consider how we run this. The index will show a list of students. So if I right-click into this inside this action and click on Go to View, you'll see that it brings me to this web page. All right. Now, an ASP.NET web page is a little different than you might be looking at when you're thinking about an HTML web page. That is, the whole page is inside the HTML page. When we think about Razor pages, all this code is all we need to make this certain component work. Okay. And I told you about the layout page earlier. The layout over here under the shared folder in views, this one looks a little bit more like the traditional web page. We've got HTML element, we've got head, we've got body, and if I collapse it, it's starting to look like a lot more like a regular web page. Now, where the information that is in my index page gets ejected is right here, where we have this render body, all right, and it's nicely wrapped into a container in a main section, all right. So every time this render body is run, it goes out and says what view am I going to render, and in this case, if we're rendering the index, it will render all of this code inside that render body, which is kind of helpful. Saves a lot of coding for sure. So when we look at how this index page is rendered, it creates a table, which is okay. We can deal with that in another video and make something a little more interesting. But essentially, what we have is our first name, last name, date of birth, create date, and edit date. These are all the features of our student model. It creates a head region of our table, all right? And then what it does down here is it iterates over the model. So if you're not familiar with what the model is, in this case, model for this page, this is how it's defined. So the at model is a IEnumerable. In other words, that's some sort of list, collection, array, and it's an IEnumerable of student. Okay. Now, something I also like to do, because I will tend to refer to things like models quite often, is I'm going to do this just for this page, and then you can obviously implement it any other time. But I'm going to do this. You can add a using statement, and you may be familiar with using statements in regular code pages, but you can do the same thing in Razor pages. And by telling it where you can find the student model, essentially that's all I've done is I just shortened my code. I kind of found that other version was a little bit messy and hard to read, but now I've shortened it and it just says IEnumerable student, which is a little more like what I'm expecting to see when I return the list of students, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so with all that, when we're iterating over our model, it will output the first name, last name, date of birth, create date, and edit date for any student who is in the database. The final row or a final cell that it puts out is basically controls. It says edit, details, and delete. So with these, it's going to go out and put out links that I can implement, and when I click on them, you'll see when we run this, I can click on them and edit an item, get the details of an item, or even delete an item. Okay. So we're going to deal with index right now. So we're going to run this, and I'll show you what happens. So maybe there's data in my database. I'm not sure. I have a sense that I deleted the data in the database, but when we get to our create method, we will be able to demonstrate that. Now, when I run this, in order to actually get to the controller's index page, all right, we have to think about how this controller works. So right now my page is running in the background. It's just sitting open. The controller is referenced by everything before the word controller. That's essentially all it does, is it essentially just goes out and looks at all the controller classes, and when it's building the assembly of code, it says I have a endpoint named students in this case, so set that up as something that if someone calls students, I will get to it. So to get to there, I can just put slash and students, just like that, and then we go into our students. Now, we have, in this case, we have two entries already. And if I click on details, you'll see it looks like that, fairly boring details page. If I go to delete, it looks like this, typical delete page. And this is right out of the box as well. So these are just things that are automatically implemented in your ASP.NET Core application. So let's go ahead and we're going to delete some of these just to get us started with a fresh data set. Okay. And if you remember the last video in part 2, I did a few modifications to the model in the display attributes. I had the model saying first and name rather than first name altogether. So it's given it a little space here. So when we call, go back over to our index, when we call display name for, all right, that's going to be going back over to our model. And let's just right click on that and just refresh everyone's memory. Display. So it's looking for this display attribute and the name attribute and then whatever you called it. Okay. So that's kind of an interesting little attribute there that allows us to build how something is to be displayed in one place. And that's good coding there, I believe. So let's go back over to student controller. So now we know how our list works. So, or at least our index page. Now let's just stop this and just understand what it's doing in the index action. So right now, it is an asynchronous action, okay, which means that anything that we're returning in this case has to be wrapped in a task and just the way it's doing. And whenever we're calling any of the functions within this action, we're going to add an await that is if we're calling it, that is if we're calling an asynchronous action or method or function. In this case, it's a function because it's returning a list. Okay, so we have our data context, and it's what we're saying here is we're saying go out to the students data context or the DB set and convert the whole thing into a list and send that into the view. Okay, so that's why it is directly inside the view parameters. So we're sending a list into that view. And by doing that, by virtue there, it receives as the model, which is an IEnumerable student. So IEnumerable essentially means I could do something like to array, right? That would be pretty much the same thing. Let's just see what else they have here. We have to dictionary. There's lookup as well. But essentially that's what we're doing here is we're passing in a list. So and a list is essentially an IEnumerable. Okay. So let's move along here. I'm going to skip details for just a moment because I want to get into the well, actually, you know what? We will look at details right now. So the details action, all right, you'll notice this little funky thing here. It says int question mark. Int question mark refers to a nullable data type. So a nullable data type essentially means that ID could have no value. And essentially, when we actually go into this code again, I'm going to show you what it looks like if it has a null value. So all that means is that ID could have nothing as a value, and it tests for that. It says if ID equals null, well, just bounce back and say it's not found, right? It's going to throw an error essentially. But if we do have an ID, what we want to do is it says go out and find me the first or default student based on the criteria of student ID equals ID. So whatever ID is, I want to find the first student that has the same ID. Okay. I could use a find here as well. Either one would be fine, but the find doesn't allow us to, in the DB set, does not allow us to have a predicate or an expression like this one. It just simply says find based on the ID, and that can be a challenge sometimes if it's not if it doesn't match the criteria you're looking for. So next step, if we found a student, then we can pass through. If we do not find a student, it then throws another error page. So it says not found. If we found the student, it passes the student into the view, just like that list ended up in the view. So if I right click here and go to the view, you'll notice that we also have this model. And in this case, it's not an IEnumerable because it's only one student. The other one was many students. It's an array. This one is just one student, okay? Because it's the details for one student. So I'm going to go off and I'm going to add the using statement that I like. And let's do that. Video dot models. Okay, we'll just take away this little extra bit of code just to make it a little cleaner. All right, now details as well. This one is using a data list. All right, so all it does here is it just creates a title and a data area for the first name, last name, date of birth, create date, edit date, etc. Each thing will be essentially a row. Okay, so that's an easy one. And it's down here. It gives us the option to edit the item, or just go right back to the index page. Okay, so let's just play that again so we kind of get an idea of how the data flows through. I was going to show you how it gets into the controller and what it looks like if I gave it a null as well. So I'm going to go back in there and I'm just going to select the controller and I'm going to put a breakpoint right about there. Okay, so let's go back into our student. Okay. Now when we get here, I'm going to create one just so we actually have a student here. Okay. There's a couple little funky things here, so you're going to see that we can create an edit date, and that's not really what we want, but we're gonna get to that in a moment. We're just putting in some fake data here. Okay. And why don't we do the same thing here? Okay, and 12, and let's just say this one's PM that we were going to put it in. So we don't want people to do this edit here, by the way, but we're going to get to that in a moment. So we're going to create that data. All right. You'll notice that the create date was created automatically for us, because if you recall, we set that up as an identity column. It will automatically create inside the database. And the edit date in this case was placed as whatever we decided to make it. So if I click on details, we click there, you'll see that the number 5 goes through as the ID. And that is only because if you look down there, if I wanted to click on inspect here, you can see it a little easier. But if you look down on the bottom there at the bottom left-hand corner, it says students/details/5. And that's because the parameter that is going in as ID is the number 5. Okay, and it's just the ID that's been auto-incremented. That's all that is. So with that, we know that ID is not null, it's a 5. So we're going to keep going. And then what we're doing here is we're running that first or default. And we know that we have a match, so it does come back with a student. All right, the student comes back as we expect it. All right, it is not null, so you can see it right there. And we play, and you'll see that the page will appear. I just got to get over to the page. Okay, and there's our details page. Now, this is what a null looks like. If I just delete that parameter and click enter, it automatically says, hey, wait a minute, I don't have an ID this time. So we're going to throw a not found, which looks like this. Okay, so if I could go back there and type in 5 again, I now have my ID back and I should have a page to display. Okay, great. All right, so now we used the create method earlier. So how does the create method work? Create method works in 2 steps. So we have a get method, which displays the form, and a post method that takes the data from the form and saves it to the database. All right. Now these are really important things to think about here. Okay. So we're gonna look at what the edit view looks like. If you recall, when I went to edit, it gave me the option to edit the edit date. And we don't want that because we don't want people just making random edits to the edit date. That's a system column. That's something that doesn't need to be edited by anyone in particular. So what we can do is we can just comment that out, right? That's the form element right here. You know, all these nice things are very nicely organized, okay? So in this case, we have this form group that was representing our edit date. Now, this is going to create some problems for us too. Okay, so when we go back over to our controller, that will display the create date or create view, but when we push submit on the form, it's going to end up over here. Okay. What's also very important to recognize is that the this bind attribute here in the parameters. All right. Now, what this is saying is that as a create method, I can send in the student ID, first name, last name, date of birth, create date, and edit date. I don't want people to do that. I don't on a create, I don't even need to do that. I don't need to have all of those features. All I actually need is first name, last name, and date of birth. I won't have an ID and I won't allow people to create a student ID either, because remember, the student ID is created in the database, not manually. Okay. So when we do that, here's what's also important. When we don't have a create and edit date, this is something really key. We have to set those manually. Okay. And when they come into us, they're going to be null values. We don't want them to be null values. We want them to be set at some point. So here's what we do to set those. So we do create date equals date time dot UTC now. Okay, and we just simply add the edit date as well. Okay. Now I could also do, actually, sorry, I don't need to set my my create date. If you recall, that one's going to be set inside the database. This one will be set before the data actually ends up in the database. Okay. So kind of nice. There's one little feature there that we can that is fairly easy to update. So let's run that. Now, there is a way that I'm going to show you hopefully later on in this video that is kind of the way the cool kids do this. We're going to override some features in the data context that will allow us to keep track or save us that extra coding in our controller, and I think you're going to like this. So let's just do this here. We're going to go into our students. I'm going to create new, and let's just create a Chris Dick 2. Okay, 12/12/1971. I'll just throw in any old date here and AM. Great. So here we have it. We have a new item that was just added. And notice that I used the UTC now feature on the date because the UTC is a universal time code. So if I always compare my dates, if I want to display it based on the universal time code, I can always be fairly safe to say if my current time zone on the client here, the client being my web browser, is 5 hours from the UTC time, then I just simply implement a UTC formatter that will allow me to display the proper time. Okay, but I will always be guaranteed, no matter where my server is running, it will always be the date that is UTC time. Okay, now we've done that change, so we've made an update. You can see these two values are roughly the same. If I displayed things like the milliseconds or nanoseconds, they probably might be a little different, but we've got a fairly consistent view here. All right. Now, when we think about what this post function does, let's just walk through it here. This statement here will validate whether the model is valid or not. So if I added something, or maybe I didn't put in a first name or a last name or a date of birth, it would count it as being invalid. And the reason it knows that it's invalid, if I go into the student model, I marked it as required. So required, required, and required. That is how it validates the model and how it knows whether it's accurate or not, whether it's the right data type. And if you recall here, I set the edit date manually. I then add the new student object to a query that essentially just says I'm gonna wait in a queue until save changes is run. Once save changes are run, it will then add it to the database. Okay, it'll actually add it at this point. Next step is it brings us directly over to the index page. Okay, so all this sort of takes us through a few steps, but very simple at this point, so nothing really too complicated. Now this last step, this is where people tend to get confused. Just note that we have a return value here. That means that after saving changes, it takes us away from this action and completes another action. In other words, it redirects to the index action. But if something went wrong, in other words, model state was not valid, it takes that parameter of student and just passes it back into the view and says something went wrong, and at some point you're going to see validation errors on your page. Now if I go over to the page and look for, here we go, so we have a validation summary, and then we have validation for first name, validation for last name, and then validation for date of birth. Okay, so each of them will have its own message to display if something went wrong. Okay, and I'll try to demonstrate that in the edit view when I get there. Moving on. So when we think about what the edit view does, edit view is similar to the way the details works. It requires an ID. Okay, in other words, if I'm going to edit something, I have to know what I'm editing. If I have null, then I don't have anything that I'm editing. There's obviously something that I haven't specified. The next step is we go off and find a student. Okay, so slightly different than the details, right? So if you look up here, I went out and said find first or default. I could do either one. Either would be a bad way of looking at it. I can do either one if you like. But you can see when in this template that's out of the box, they've said you can do the find or you can do the first or default method. Either one will work. Find to me looks a little easier. It's easier to follow. However, it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility in the ways that you may be querying the database. It just simply says, give me the primary key of the item that you're looking for. So similar to the way the details works, it says if I found a student, then just pass it into the view. If I didn't find it, display a not found. Edit also has a get routine. That is essentially what this is. And this method displays the form. So it goes out and gets the data from the database and displays a form with the student sitting there. So edit also has a post method. Okay, and a post method in edit is a little different than the post method or than the create, in that we have a student ID that will very likely be present on the form. Okay, we still have our first name, last name, and date of birth, but in this case, we don't want them to make edits to create and edit date. Now I'm just going to leave them for a moment here and show you what's happening, just so that you can see it. By sending that information into the database, whatever comes in as the student parameter being here, okay, it pushes it into the update, runs the update, and then saves the changes. Okay, so it runs an update based on data that's already in the system, compares, and then we can save the changes. So let's take a look at the edit form, and we'll talk about those create and edit dates. So you'll notice there is a hidden input for the student ID, and that's just because it's not something that we want the people on the front end to be editing easily. Okay, in other words, in order to get to that form, you'd have to inspect an area and go specifically looking for student ID. The next, we have the create and edit dates. All right, and the create and edit dates here are they're going to show up as a form element, as an input. But when we get there, we're going to recognize that, hey, I don't want people to make those changes. So we're going to show you right now what that looks like. So when we get there, what we're looking for is we're going to see that we'll have a create and edit date that are fully editable, and we don't want that. So let's go into our students. Okay, let's do an edit right here. Okay, so here we have it. We've got our create and edit date are wide open for making any changes, which again really isn't all that great. Let's say we make some changes here. I'm gonna change my date of birth. Maybe take away the 2, and we're gonna keep the edit date and create date, and just see what happens when we do that. Okay, so we've made that change. I made a date of birth change. I changed the last name. Okay, but we're going to deal with right now, we're going to deal with that create and edit date because we don't want them to show up. All right, so all we have to do is comment them out. Okay, and if you want to know a shortcut, just in case you're not familiar, it's Control K U will uncomment. Oops. Hold on a second. Well, uncomment. Maybe they won't uncomment for me. Maybe they change something. But nonetheless, Control K and C will do that. Control K U, that was wrong. Control K C will comment like that. Control K, then U will uncomment. Just a little pro tip for you. So K C, that's what I'm using there. All right, great. So we've commented those areas out. Now watch what happens when I go back in and try to change some things here. You're going to see that we're going to lose our create date, okay, and our edit date actually in this case. And you'll see why we need to do some changes to our controller. So if I go off and do an edit here, okay, I don't have a create date form. There's nothing coming from a form into my post. So let's in fact put a breakpoint in our edit post statement. Okay, and I'll put it just at this model is valid. Now I'm going to save that. So model shows as valid. All right. I have a student ID of 6. And that means that I have a student. Now take a look at our create date and edit date. That is the null value of our of date time. Okay, then that's not good because if I go through saving this, I'm going to lose my create and edit date. So we don't want that. So how do we fix that? Let's click on stop here. I'm not going to let it go through. So how do we fix that? We're going to do this. So I'm going to do student dot edit date equals datetime dot UTC now. So I'm going to set the edit date before it gets to this update. Okay. The next thing that we want to do is we want to tell the context to not edit the property called create date. So here we're going to do context dot entry. Okay. The entry is student, all right, and we're going to dot property, and we're going to do a query on the property that we don't want changed. I'm going to say create date dot state, dot is modified. Sorry, dot is modified. Thinking old school entity framework. Is modified equals false. Okay, so what this is going to do, just so you understand, I set a new edit date, which will, of course, make it just fine. We're okay with that. And then after I run update, I then say, okay, by the way, don't change the property of create date. Now, its placement is very important, okay? We have to run the property is modified false after the update because it's basically saying it's going out and saying queuing it up to be updated, and then down here we say don't update the create date but allow everything else to make changes. Okay, so let's run that again. Now when we run this, what we should see is the only thing that changes is our edit date. So we'll just take note of our edit date here when we get into the page. Okay, so we get in here and let's look at our edit date. It says 12/12, 7/12, 12/22. Sorry, I can't read today. When I click on edit, all right, I'm gonna make a change. And maybe I'll just throw some date of birth changes as well. Save that, and you see that it has changed the time. Okay, that's really important to recognize. Okay, but it did not, however, change the create date. All right, let's try that again, just so everybody can see this again. Take note of that time, 7/25/27. Click on edit, and change that back. And we'll save. Okay, so right now we're at 25/51. So we only changed that. We took note of also the create date. It was 7/12/23, and we've made an update here. Okay, so really interesting stuff. It's pretty easy to implement, but it's always good to have these little finer points. These things are pretty key to understanding how to manage the data that goes in and out of the system and how to track some simple things like creating the create date and edit date features. For me, these are a common feature of almost every database that I do. All right. Now, delete. If we get down to delete here, delete has a different way of doing things as well. The delete feature, what it does is it looks very similar to our edit, which it simply goes out and says, hey, do we have an ID? And it says, yes, I found an ID. Does a first or default find and says, give me the student ID where it equals ID. And if we find a student, we pass it into the delete view. Let's go into the delete view now. So our delete view looks very similar to our details page. And in fact, a lot of people will combine these views. So they'll create a details or delete view as a partial view, and maybe later on I'll do a video about partial views. But right now I'm going to focus on how this stuff works. So it looks very similar to our details page. We can include the create and edit date, things like that. So that makes it, very simple, very standard view. It also is asking us, are you sure you want to delete? So it hasn't done the delete at this point. It's only gone off and and retrieved the page here, so that when it gets there, it's going to say, hey, do you want to delete? Are you sure? And here we're saying, yep, I want to delete. I'm going to run the submit of delete. Okay. When we hit that button, it then ends up into this action, the delete confirmed action. Okay. And it goes out and finds the student. Again, they choose find here. You can use the finder default just the same. And then we remove the student from the stack. Essentially, we put it into a query of things that the database is going to do. Once we run that save changes, it commits the changes to the database, and then we are redirected to index. Okay. Finally, there's this one little function here, which is kind of an interesting one. It's interesting that they put it in. I don't see it used too often, but let's just see what it says here. It is using there it is. Okay. So this was an interesting little error, and I didn't talk about this one. So what it is, this is actually in the edit post function. And the concurrency checking, okay, concurrency essentially is going to go off and say, is this thing being edited at the same time, and do I actually have a student that exists while this thing is being edited? So if I get an error like this, it essentially means that it's saving to the database and something goes wrong, okay, and the database reports the wrong number of rows. You can actually see in the description here what that means, what the database concurrency error actually does. From here, checks to see whether we actually have a student or not, and it's a quick way of doing it. All that has to do is just check to see whether it exists or not. It doesn't return anything. It just simply returns it does return a Boolean value, whether it's true or false, but it doesn't return an object. It's just a true or false. Okay. So that is that. All right. Now, one of the things that I said I was going to do earlier is I was going to do things the way the cool kids do it. All right. We're going to make some edits. When you look at what we have to do here, we have to, every time we do this template controller, we have to do these little mods everywhere, and that's more effort. Like, why do we want to put so much effort every time? We had to make 2 edits here, move some things around. That means we have to retest things. Well, that's not really effective coding. So what you want to be thinking of here is moving to a point where everything that runs the add method and the update method essentially gets this edit date applied. All right, it's just one more step that if you do it in a central location, you don't have to do it 30 other times. Because essentially, as a coder, if one day your boss comes in and says, we have to change all of these UTC nows to now, that's a lot of UTC nows. You could spend hours going through an enterprise level application trying to fix them. So let's dig in here and look at how does this add method actually work. And notice it's part of our data context. All right, but when we go over to our data context, it's not there. All right, and that is because it's actually part of this base level model of DB context, which means that I can override that method. Okay, and if you look here, I've got a whole bunch of things that I can override, all these things. Okay, and that's pretty cool because I can do a lot with this. So let's override the add of T entity. Okay, because if I go back over here, you'll see it's running like this. Says it's doing the add. T entity, by the way, is student. All right, and it puts the student model in as entity. Okay, so if we go back over here, um, all it did here is just add an override, and it says, and it just calls the base method of add, or base function of add. And by pushing into that goes directly into the DB contact, which is the base level. If I just do this the way it is right now, I can run it without any kind of challenge. It'll run exactly the same it normally will. All right. I'll go to students here. I'll do an add. Okay, let's click there. Let's do Chris 4. Do a couple other changes. A couple quick bits of information. So now I have a 4 and a 3, and that essentially means that my add method worked. All right. So if I click stop, what I want to do here is I want to do some modifications because I still haven't got rid of my edit date. So, well, what are we going to do? Well, what we want to do right now is we want to remove that edit date. So I'm going to comment that out for now. And here's how we're going to make this work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture the data that comes back from base.add. Okay. And the way we do that is because base.add returns an entity of T entity type. Okay. And essentially that's what entity add returns as. It doesn't know, this is kind of an interesting thing to recognize, it doesn't know what a T entity is. Okay. So by making that change, that won't change anything right now. All it does is just move the return value of the add into a variable and then return it. So what we want to do here is we want to add this little bit of code that captures the information from entity. Okay, and by using this entry function, it essentially does kind of like a lookup. All right. And we're going to tell it that we want to change the value of a property. Now, here's where things get a little funky. This should be a student. If I'm passing in a student, I should have a student. But notice that I have no properties of a student. And that is because I have no idea what entity is, what the T entity is. So I have to create something called an interface, which essentially tricks it into saying, call the edit date or edit date property of T entity. Now, this is going to fail if there is no T entity property. So just be aware of that. So if your student object doesn't have a create or edit date or one of these features, it will error out. So here's how we do this. We're going to create a model, and this is a special type of model called an interface. The interface is kind of like a set of controls on like a car radio or something like that. And essentially what we're saying here is it has some features that are pre-programmed features. Okay, I'm going to call this iEntity model, and I'm calling it this because the entity essentially refers to a data entity, and it's a model because we're referring to things like students, and student in this case is just the type of model. Okay, the interface has two properties. Okay, it has a create and edit date. Create date. Well, let's copy that and call it edit date. There we go. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to cast X as an iEntity model. Okay. And to do that, it's kind of a little trick that object-oriented program can do. So now, the way I've set up these brackets, essentially the brackets now cast X as an iEntity. Okay. Now again, I still don't know what this is, and I may run into problems if I don't have an edit date property, but it will make its best efforts to make a change to edit date. Now from this point, I'm going to edit the current value, and I'm going to change the current value to datetime.utc now. So this function right here replaces, if we go back over to our controller, replaces this function. But if I created other types of controllers that do exactly the same kind of thing with a different model, I would never have to change any of that code, which is pretty cool. So let's save that. And let's go back over to our context. I think we should be in good shape. Notice here that I'm not using entity add. Okay, entity is the one that we're going to be updating. So it's just checking to see whatever's on the stack that relates to entity. This one here is kind of held in place, and it won't allow you to make any changes, but we can refer to it based on entity. So let's give this a shot. So when we run this, what we should be able to see is that our edit date changes as necessary when we do an add. Okay, this is a key point. We're doing an add at this point. Okay, and we'll click on create. Again, I'm gonna do Chris 5 this time. Create our iterations, right? Okay. We'll go through there, push create, and now we have our 5 and we have our create and edit date are the same. Okay, so we just increased our functionality tenfold, all right, for adds, but what about edit? All right, edits are very similar, the way to do things. What we will do is we're going to now, if you remember, we call an update method in our student controller. So let's go over to student controller just to show you. We call this, all right. What we're going to do now is modify the update method in the data context. Okay, so we look for update, and we're looking for the T entity update. Okay, from here, now similar kind of method that we're going to do. We're going to do entity update. All right, now you don't have to call it that. You can call it X if you want. It doesn't make any difference. What we're doing, essentially the same thing we did before, just returning it into a variable. We are going to do the same stuff that we did with our edit date, like that. Okay, but this time we have to also say, hey, by the way, we don't want to modify our create date. So let's go over and copy that information, and we're going to go back over here. We don't need context because we are in context, and we're going to be editing the entity, not the student as we were before. We also have our cast of X. We just copy that, replace X. Take a look at it right there. And we're saying that the create date is unmodified. It's false. Okay, so let's run that again. Oops, hang on a second. I have to comment out my areas in the student controller. That would be valuable. Okay, comment that out. And all we have is our update. This would be exactly what came in with the student controller, or that when I built my student controller, this is exactly what was there. So now I can go back into our students, and once I go there, I'm going to go to the edit function and take note of the dates here. I've got 754 and 754. If I click edit, let's do an edit on that. We'll save, and now we are now 757 and continue to say 754. No changes have been made to the create date, but we did, however, update the edit date. We'll try that one more time just to show you. All right, and there we have it again, new change. Okay, this is a long video. Doing controllers can take a little more time than I like to spend on videos, but I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe. I love the comments. Keep the positive stuff coming. If you have anything to suggest in videos, please do. I do read these, and I try to respond as best as I can. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good day.